We're about to record, Papa. Actually, he might stop meowing at you if you pet him. I don't know if you're allergic to cats. He's a very friendly cat. He will not, even if he bites you, it won't. No, like it'll be a play bite. It doesn't hurt. Now, Ava, on the other hand, is another story. All right. And thank you for listening to Nuance, a current events podcast from me, Roberto Alejandro, journalist and founder of OnBackground.com, and my co-host, police scientist Mike Wood. And we are joined again today by public health expert, activist in the movement for Black Lives, and best friend forever of the show, Dr. Lawrence Brown, for a discussion about the impacts of lead poisoning on our society. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for joining us again.
Always good to be here, especially as a best friend of the show.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, you've described the impacts of lead poisoning as an ongoing crisis and as a state of emergency. And I quote you from what you said offline to me 5 minutes ago. But speak a little bit about what the impact of lead poisoning is on our society as you understand it.
Well, I want to narrow the scope to,
sure.
Well, 500,000 children are poisoned every year, if I understand correctly, in America.
Wow.
But in Baltimore, since 1993, we've had 65,466 children poisoned by lead in our city at over 10 micrograms per deciliter of lead. Now, what that means is that we've had a huge number of children poisoned with a developmental toxicant, a neurotoxicant that impacts the brain and the development of human beings. It's a heavy metal, doesn't belong in the human body, and it has multiple impacts. It's implicated in the folks having ADD and ADHD, controlling behavior, and it's correlated with violence in that sense. People have a difficult time controlling their violent impulses with this neurotoxicant. It's also implicated in lowered cognition. People have lower IQ with lead poison. It's connected with people having elevated, maybe 2.3 times higher chance of having major depressive disorder and a 4.9 times higher chance of having panic disorder. Mm. So lead poison then is this major issue that has a crazy impact on the human body, and we're allowing it to wreck the brains and bodies of black bodies of children in Baltimore City without any sort of real recourse.
I mean, it's interesting, particularly in light of what you mentioned about the resulting depressive disorders, because depressive disorders themselves can lead to impulsive or violent behavior.
Right.
And so is this a situation where violence itself might be a consequence of this, but it also might be a sort of compounded consequence of other consequences as well?
Absolutely. I think it is compounding because with elevated violence, you have elevated levels of trauma. More people with PTSD after family or friend has experienced a homicide or they've been shot. So the trauma that comes from there, vicarious trauma, the trauma of just knowing that violence is happening in your community overall, gunshots, children having trouble sleeping at night. So, and we know that trauma, urban PTSD is a real issue, for instance, because there's a lot of violence in many of our urban communities. So I think, the compounding impacts of lead poison are tremendous, and we absolutely should have a state of emergency here in Baltimore City, just like Flint, Michigan.
Do we have a sense of whether the potential impacts of lead poisoning are more prominent in these sort of Rust Belt cities that haven't had sort of thriving economies in quite some time, especially and really in the decades where we most likely would have been in the process of lead abatement as opposed to just simply sort of using it as a product?
Well, I mean, I'm not so sure that there's really an economic rationale. It's really more so we knew in the 30s, and even before then, that lead had a negative impact on the health of children. We just refused to do anything about it. We continued to allow lead paint companies to put lead in the paint up until 1950, if I'm not mistaken, or 78. We had lead in our gasoline. We had lead on children's toys in the 30s. So we had lead proliferating in our society, and really you can watch the crime curve very much follow the way that lead is infused with gasoline. As it goes up, crime goes up with a 20-year delay. And when we extracted lead and pulled it out of our gasoline, crime goes down on that 20-year lag. So the science is really, stunningly sharp on the impact of lead and crime. And I think, if we're in Baltimore City experiencing so much crime in terms of, we had 344 homicides last year. We're on pace to break 300 homicides this year. It's lead poison is something that, if we're talking about the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, it's another thing that should be really at the forefront of the agenda.
Yeah. And I mean, just to contextualize that number, Baltimore is a city of 650,000 people. I mean, I have a friend of mine who's from Sandtown, Winchester, which is one of the sort of rougher neighborhoods. And I feel like every 2 weeks he texts me like, I lost another homeboy.
Right.
I mean, it's staggering the pace at which this friend of mine loses folks that he grew up with or knew his whole life.
Yeah, in Sandtown, Winchester, Harlan Park, that's a cluster of area where there's a high level of lead paint violations, a high level of children being poisoned by lead paint. Freddie Gray grew up in that community, as did one of the 6 officers involved in his death, William Porter. And they were both lead poisoned, except William Porter and his family, they moved to just south of Roland Park when he was in middle school, whereas Freddie Gray ended up staying in that area. Yeah. And Freddie Gray, of course, was poisoned at 36 micrograms per deciliter of lead in his blood. So you're talking about this really high level of lead poisoning that who knows if that contributed to his impulsivity to run.
Sure.
When the police came, and then being in a high crime area that was legal for them to chase him, and it contributed to his death.
And, we've talked a little bit offline about segregation and how that informs a lot of different sort of social ills today. How much does the fact that, like you mentioned, Harlan Park, Sandtown, Winchester, this very small geographic area where we sort of shoved a lot of people who look, very similar to one another into this small area as a result of the segregative practices, some of which were pioneered here in Baltimore. Is that having a sort of effect of amplifying the results of the lead poisoning?
Well, we know, for instance, that Sandtown, Winchester is like the number one community in the entire state of Maryland in terms of the amount of spending on people in prisons in Maryland. We spend more for people that are from that community than any other community in the entire state. So I think what we look at when we talk about racial segregation, we're talking about disinvested redline Black communities that didn't matter. And you can't really make Black lives matter until you make Black neighborhoods matter. Or you can't make Black lives matter without making Black neighborhoods matter. And without, what we're saying is, slumlords, they proliferate in these communities, which means that they're trying to maximize profits so they don't abate the lead in those communities. They're processing fake lead-free certifications. And so you have this just compounding, cascading problem where lead poison is allowed. So then it impacts everything from academic achievement to police interactions. Because again, Freddie Gray was poisoned by lead. Corinne Gaines, who was killed by the Baltimore County Police, she was poisoned by lead in Baltimore City as well. So these things tend to prop up later in the lifespan.
And you posed a question, and I want to bring Mike in at this point, which is, how do we effectively train police to interact with persons in spaces where we know that lead exposure has been a rampant problem? And so I know, Mike, in your own program for police reform, lead abatement is, or lead poisoning, I should say, is a major component. So speak a little bit about your thoughts on that.
Well, if I'm supposed to be a police scientist and I'm supposed to solve crime, I'm supposed to look at evidence of what causes crime. And if we're going to put the charts into the show notes and we're put some further information in there, but like it's actually not 20 years, it's right about 23 years is where they have the highest turnover. But in the 1970s, when they set the acceptable blood levels, and then in 73 is when they did the EPA phase out of the leaded gasoline. In 78, they did residential paint bans, and then they kept doing things as they go on to lower the lead poisoning exposure rates. And now what we see is, like, we look at New York. And New York's famous crime reduction that's attributed to Giuliani and stop and frisk and all this other ridiculousness.
He fixed all those windows, man.
Though they got their exposure down to 2.1, and the acceptable level is now, it's even been lowered from the 40 they set it at the 70s. But so they got it down to a record number of hyper-segregated cities in the country. So that is why New York's crime rate went down. It has nothing to do with aggressive policing or anything like that. So if that's what brought the most dramatic example of crime reduction in the entire world history that I'm aware of, which was what happened in New York City, that comes completely from the lead poisoning and abating it to get that down. The correlation is unbelievable. So the way they go into it, and this is what we have to educate cops on, is just knowing the information. Is that they even took this and took it over once they identified it here in America, some scientists took it over to Europe and they started doing it in Europe. And the exact same thing happened when they got the lead down, the violent crime went down. And Dr. Bernard Gesch, who was one of the scientists on this, he estimates that 90% of changing crime rate during the 20th century across the entire world is due to lead poisoning. So it's obviously the thing that we have to fight. Its studies have continued to grow, but we haven't looked at it. And so when it comes, it all ties into this history that we have of hypersegregation and everything else, because not only were these areas poisoned environmentally, they took redlining and put black people into the already environmentally poisoned areas and environmentally poisoned the areas that they were already in by not caring with landlords and stuff like this. So we know that that's what it is. Like, it's easy to educate on this particular topic. So the thing is how do we stop these interactions and how do police understand this? I really think it falls under the overall idea that we have to change what policing is. Like, if somebody has lead poisoning problems in the way they lash out and a cop acts a certain way, that interaction exchanges. My problem is this interaction and the way this tone is set. So while people do need to understand this, I think if we don't get into these confrontational interactions where we're trying to take what little somebody has away from them, then we're not going to face the repercussions so much of the violence if we can be a little more empathetic.
I mean, we've talked about a number of things related, in terms of talking about lead poisoning, but Dr. Brown, you also mentioned, the various traumas that exist. And it does seem to me that there are a lot of sort of behavior parallels, in terms of both like the effects of trauma psychologically and the effects of lead poisoning. Would a style of policing better informed by an understanding about trauma in general, especially the sort of like intergenerational trauma that exists in poor spaces, could that go a lot further than other maybe sort of attempts at reform or policy changes by itself in terms of improving these interactions? If police were trained to assume that trauma is going to play a role in most interactions in these spaces.
My whole problem always comes into, I don't care what they're trained in. Like, I think it's a huge distraction. We don't need a big education to know that you don't kill Corinne Gaines with a 5-year-old son sitting right there. I mean, it just doesn't, it's not an education issue. There's empathy and human compassion for one another that's kind of overwhelming those things. And when we don't have that, it seems like we are just like, no matter what angle we go to, we're going to have problems.
But I mean, let me just push on the training side, because I mean, I do agree with you, but at the same time, like, we live in a particular intellectual milieu, and one of the certain great streams in that milieu is Christianity, and that informs a lot of our sort of policy moralizing, and especially our sort of punitive approach to not just within the policy realm, but within the realm of behavior in general.
But I'm totally against the punitive approach.
No, absolutely. But in light of the fact that, inevitably police officers most of them are going to be coming from the United States. They're going to be coming from a context where we've learned to think about behaviors largely in terms of the responsibility of the individual over them, and the need for the rational mind to control the appetites of the body. Do those persons need to be sort of made aware of the way those streams are informing their interpretation of behaviors?
Maybe I'm completely biased because my degree is in management. But if I tell you that it's wrong to walk out of this door, but every time you walk out the door, I give you $100, well, you're going to keep walking out the damn door. So, and conversely...
Could we implement that policy?
We cannot implement that policy at this moment. and conversely, the same thing would happen. If I told you to go out that door and I would give you $100 and I didn't do it, it wouldn't take long before you just stopped walking out of that door. So what we tell people and what we train them for is important. But if we have a system that it completely disincentivizes the continuation of that pattern, then it's all for naught. So that's my big objection is we think we can train a cop to be different, but when he's trained, he or she's trained, they're then put into that system, which will incentivize them towards corruption, and it's just a matter of time.
And then let me just pose one final question to both of you. And I want to bring up the issue of gun control, because this is definitely like a major fissure, right, in terms of the left-right of our politics. And I know when I interviewed Police Commissioner Kevin Davis, the Baltimore City Police Commissioner, shortly after he took over the interim position, he talked a lot about his focus being on, seeing the number of illegal guns that they get off the street. And I think there is a narrative that guns in urban environments drive the violence. But and certainly on the right, they say, there's the whole sort of like guns don't kill people, people kill people. And so we're back to that whole personal responsibility trope. But in light of what we've said about lead poisoning, in policing policy, particularly in urban environments, is gun control, gun reduction really the best place to focus? Or is that really just a symptom with something like lead poisoning being a more relevant cause?
Well, two things. One, I want to say that we've actually had a great reduction in high-level lead poison. Now we're dealing with much more of a low-level lead poisoning crisis. The second thing, I'm not really expert on guns, but I will say that the fact that when you think about, we just passed a toy gun ban here in Baltimore City, and Kevin Davis, our commissioner, said that if Dedrick Colvin, who was a 13-year-old that got shot by the Baltimore police with a BB gun that he said, the officer said looked real, he said that if it was his children, they wouldn't have been shot. If they were white children, they wouldn't have been shot, but this black child was shot. So it occurs to me that if we're banning the toy gun instead of banning the racism that would allow white children not to be shot as opposed to black children. So there's something there that I think we're missing. And we definitely need, I think, some sort of gun reduction, but we also need police reduction in violence as well.
So, right, fundamentally, guns aren't the problem. It's the people. I get that. But the thing is you can't fix people as easily as you can fix guns not being around. So that is your big problem. I mean, our country has the highest saturation of guns, and we have the highest gun violence. This is another one of those correlations that I don't need to discuss with anybody. If you believe otherwise, you just are uninformed, and I don't even want to worry about it.
But in light of the fact that our Constitution does guarantee gun ownership as a right, I mean, you can interpret it different, but at this point, the Supreme Court has spoken.
The Supreme Court has determined that, not the Constitution.
And our jurisprudence and our Constitution, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, gives the Supreme Court final adjudication of all constitutional law matters. So, I mean, at least as far as our polity is concerned, this is kind of, for now at least, a settled issue. But in light of the idea that it is technically a right under the Constitution, and in light of the fact that the number of people who die every year from guns is roughly the same to the number of people who die in car accidents, right? And we don't see a major sort of public policy outcry to reduce car accidents, even though, right, your average car accident is probably a function.
A car accident and
well, I mean, they're not the same thing, but in terms of the overall cost on society, just from a policy standpoint, right? Like we might, if as a society we don't object to that number of traffic fatalities, you could look at it and say that's essentially a tacit acceptance of this number of deaths as socially acceptable.
I don't know. I think you're wrong. I mean, I think we don't accept the traffic thing. I think we work incredibly hard at that. Elon Musk is probably our premier brain, and that's like one of his primary focus is to pretty much eliminate that. So,
but you would agree that there's less discussion about the need to reduce traffic
right,
deaths,
because we've done a lot of
guns.
it. We've had incredible reduction, and we're still going the opposite way in gun control. But what I tell them all the time is I get your position. But if you end the drug war, and we can get lead abatement out, and we can do those two programs, I'll revisit your gun situation. But until then, like we can't allow that to continue to occur.
I'd say, I like the idea of like the gun buyback programs. I think we have to have robust. We ought to do that more in a more systematic way, because I do think America has more guns, more violence. The correlation that Mike just mentioned. So anything we can do to get guns off the streets, I think will definitely help.
And there it is. We have just solved both lead poisoning and guns in America. You've been listening to Nuance with Roberto Alejandro, my co-host Mike Wood. Thank you very much. And Dr. Lawrence Brown.
Always a pleasure.
Best friend forever.
One of my favorite people in the world.
Best friend forever of the show for a reason.